The medallion sat in his palm like a secret waiting to crack open. 25 cents. That's all Tobias Marsh had paid for it. The last coin to his name, traded for a piece of tarnished metal nobody else wanted. He'd bought it out of desperation, not hope. A man with empty pockets doesn't believe in treasure maps. He turned it over in his calloused hands, feeling the weight of it. Cheap brass, probably some trinket a peddler couldn't sell. But it was something. And right now, something was more than he had yesterday. The general store smelled like dried tobacco and old wood. Faye Carile stood behind the counter, watching him with eyes that lingered a second too long. He didn't notice. He never did. She'd been watching him for months now. Ever since he'd started coming in looking thinner each week, his shirts hanging looser on his frame. She wanted to say something. Offer him credit. Slip an extra pound of flour into his bag without charging. But Tobias Marsh was a proud man, and pride in a starving man is a wall you can't climb. He pocketed the medallion and left without looking back. That night, alone in the rented room above the saddle shop, he tried to clean it. The tarnish came off in black streaks on the rag, revealing intricate engravings underneath. His hands stilled. These weren't decorative flourishes. These were deliberate, purposeful. He held it closer to the lamp. The engravings formed patterns he couldn't read, symbols that looked like they belonged to a language nobody spoke anymore. He traced them with his thumb, feeling the grooves worn smooth by time. Then he found the seam. It was almost invisible, hidden in the design. He pressed his thumbnail into it and twisted. The medallion split open with a soft click that echoed too loud in the quiet room. Inside, etched into the inner surfaces, was a map. Tobias stared at it, his breath caught somewhere between his throat and his chest. 2 locations were marked with crude X symbols. The first was closer, maybe 2 days' ride to the northeast. The second sat further, beyond a series of mountain ridges he recognized from years of working in these territories. No words, no explanation, just those 2 marks and a series of lines that could have been roads or rivers or nothing at all. He closed the medallion and set it on the table. Then he opened it again, as if checking to make sure it was real. The map was still there, still impossible, still promising something he couldn't name. His stomach growled, reminding him that promises don't fill empty bellies. He thought about the medallion, about the care someone had taken to hide that map inside, about the 2 locations and what might be waiting there. Then he thought about the reality of his situation. No money, no work, no prospects. Winter was coming, and winter didn't care about pride. This is probably nothing, he told himself. Some fool's errand. A drunk's joke etched into metal and sold to whoever was desperate enough to bite. But what if it wasn't? He looked at the map again. The first location was close enough. 2 days there, maybe 1 day to search, 2 days back. He could rent a horse, promise to return it quickly. If he found nothing, he'd be out the rental fee and 5 days of his life. If he found something... He closed the medallion and slipped it into his pocket. The next morning, he walked to the stable at the edge of town. The owner, a thin man with suspicious eyes and tobacco-stained teeth, looked him up and down like he was measuring Tobias for a coffin. Tobias needed a horse for 5 days, he said, maybe 6. Had work lined up at a ranch to the northeast. Good pay. He'd be back with the rental fee and extra for the trouble. The stable owner spat into the dirt. 3 days, he said. Not 5, not 6. 3. And if Tobias came back late, the fee doubled. If he didn't come back at all, the owner would find him and take it out of his hide. Tobias agreed because he had no choice. He rode out that afternoon with nothing but the clothes on his back, a canteen of water, and a medallion that promised everything or nothing at all. The land changed as he rode northeast. The flat scrub gave way to rolling hills covered in sparse brush and scattered rock formations that jutted from the earth like broken teeth. By the second day, his back ached from the saddle, and his throat felt like sandpaper despite rationing the water. He followed the map as best he could, matching landmarks to the crude lines etched inside the medallion. A fork in a dried creek bed, 3 hills that rose in descending height, a rock face that caught the afternoon sun and turned it into blinding white light. Late on the second day, he found it. The cave entrance was hidden behind a collapse of boulders, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. He dismounted and approached on foot, leading the horse by its reins. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through sideways. He tied the horse to a stunted tree and grabbed the small lamp he'd brought. The wick caught on the third try, casting weak yellow light that barely pushed back the darkness. Inside, the cave opened into a chamber about the size of a modest room. The air was cool and dry, untouched by wind or weather. His lamplight caught something near the back wall, a shape too regular to be natural stone. A chest. It sat there like it had been waiting for him, or for anyone brave enough or desperate enough to find it. The wood was old, the metal bands rusted but intact. No lock, just a simple latch that lifted with a scrape of corroded metal. Tobias opened it. Gold coins spilled into the lamplight, dozens of them, their faces worn smooth by age, but unmistakably valuable. Beneath them, 3 pocket watches, their chains tangled together, their cases engraved with initials he didn't recognize. Deeper still, a collection of stones, rough-cut rubies and emeralds that caught the light and held it like they were stealing pieces of the sun. He sat back on his heels, breathing hard. This wasn't a fortune, not the kind that bought land or built empires, but it was more money than he'd seen in 5 years, maybe more than he'd see in the rest of his life if he kept living the way he'd been living. His hands shook as he counted the coins. 43 in total. The watches alone were worth something to the right buyer. The stones, he had no idea, but they looked real enough. Then he found the second map. It was rolled tight and tucked into the corner of the chest, sealed with wax that crumbled when he touched it. He unrolled it carefully, holding it close to the lamp. This one was more detailed than the medallion's crude sketch. It showed the same 2 locations, but the second one now had additional markings. A riddle was written in careful script at the bottom. Where the sun dies 3 times, the true treasure sleeps in eternal gold. Tobias read it 3 times, trying to make sense of it. Where the sun dies 3 times. He looked at the map, at the markings around the second location. 3 mountain peaks drawn in careful detail, their summits reaching toward the western sky. 3 peaks where the sun would set behind them, one after another, as the day died. He looked back at the chest, at the coins and watches and stones. This was enough, more than enough. He could take this, sell it quietly, disappear somewhere new, and start over. The smart thing would be to take what he had and forget about the second location. But the riddle stayed with him. The true treasure, not this. This was just the beginning. A test, maybe, or a lure. Something to prove the map was real before you risked everything for what came next. He made his decision. He would take enough to fund the journey to the second location. The rest he'd hide here, buried near the cave entrance where he could find it again if things went wrong. He'd need supplies, better clothes for mountain travel, maybe help deciphering that riddle. He'd need money. 2 days later, he returned to town. 5 days overdue and bracing for the stable owner's anger. The stable owner was waiting for him when he rode in, arms crossed and jaw set tight. Tobias dismounted slowly, feeling every sore muscle in his back protest the movement. 5 days overdue. The man's eyes tracked him like a hawk watching a rabbit. "You're late," the owner said. His voice was flat and dangerous. 5 days late. That's double the fee. $20. Tobias reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 gold coins. They caught the afternoon light, turning it into something warm and promising. He held them out. "These should cover it," he said. "And then some." The stable owner's expression changed. His eyes widened just enough to notice. and he took the coins carefully, turning them over in his palm like they might vanish if he squeezed too hard. He bit one, testing it. Real gold. Old, too, by the look of the worn faces and strange markings. "Where'd you get these?" the owner asked, but it wasn't really a question, more like an accusation wrapped in curiosity. "Found them," Tobias said. "Had a lucky streak. We square?" The stable owner nodded slowly, still staring at the coins. "Yeah, we're square." He looked up at Tobias, and something calculating moved behind his eyes. "You find any more of these lucky streaks, you let me know. I might have work for a man who knows where to look." Tobias took the horse's reins and led it toward the stable. "I'll keep that in mind," he said, knowing he wouldn't. He left before the questions could start. By sunset, half the town had heard about the coins. The stable owner hadn't wasted time. He'd gone straight to the saloon, showing off his strange payment to anyone who'd buy him a drink to hear the story. "2 gold coins," he said. "Old as dirt, paid by some carpenter who claimed he'd just gotten lucky." Darius Gentry heard about it before the sun had fully set. He sat in the back corner of the saloon, nursing a whiskey that cost more than most men made in a week, and listened. When the stable owner described the coins, Darius leaned forward. When the man mentioned the markings, the strange symbols worn almost smooth, Darius stood up. He crossed the room and put a hand on the stable owner's shoulder. Not rough, but firm enough to get attention. "Let me see those coins," he said. The stable owner hesitated, then pulled them from his pocket. Darius took them and held them up to the lamplight. His breath caught. He knew these markings. He had seen them before in the private collection of a man who died 20 years ago, a man who'd spent his life hunting for a treasure that supposedly didn't exist. The Cardoza family cache. Spanish gold hidden before the territories changed hands. Hundreds of pieces scattered and lost when the family was wiped out in a raid. Coins like these were supposed to be legend, fairy tales told by drunk prospectors and desperate treasure hunters. But here were 2 of them, real and solid in his hand. "Who paid you with these?" Darius asked. "Marsh, Tobias Marsh, carpenter. Rents that room above the saddle shop." Darius handed the coins back and walked out without another word. By the time he reached the street, he'd already sent one of his men to watch Tobias, another to ask questions, a third to find out everything about where Marsh had been for the past 5 days. Tobias didn't know any of this yet. He was walking toward Faye's general store, the second map burning a hole in his pocket, and questions burning a hole in his mind. He needed to understand that riddle. He needed supplies for a longer journey, and he needed someone who wouldn't ask too many questions about why a broke carpenter suddenly had money to spend. The bell above the door chimed when he entered. Faye looked up from the counter, and her expression shifted when she saw him. Relief, maybe, or something else he couldn't quite name. "You're back," she said. He nodded. "Need to buy some things. Rope, dried meat, another canteen. And I need to ask you something. You're educated. You know languages and symbols and such." She came around the counter, closer than she needed to be. "What kind of symbols?" He pulled out the second map and unrolled it on the counter. Her eyes widened when she saw the riddle at the bottom. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "Does it matter?" She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw something in her expression he'd never noticed before. Something that looked like hope, mixed with fear. "It matters to me," she said quietly. He didn't answer. Instead, he asked, "Can you help me figure out what it means?" She traced the words with her finger, then looked at the map, at the 3 peaks drawn in careful detail. "I can help," she said. "But not here. Too many ears. Come to my house tonight. After dark." He started to argue, to say they could just talk in the back room, but she shook her head. "Trust me," she said. "If you found what I think you found, you don't want anyone else knowing about it." He looked into her eyes and saw that she meant it, saw something else there too, something he couldn't quite name but recognized all the same. "Tonight?" he agreed. Outside in the gathering dusk, one of Darius Gentry's men watched through the window and made notes about everything he saw. Tobias knocked on Faye's door after the town had gone quiet. She answered quickly, like she'd been waiting just on the other side. The lamplight behind her turned her into a silhouette, and for a moment, he forgot why he'd come. She stepped aside to let him in. Her house was small but clean, with books stacked on shelves and dried herbs hanging from the rafters. It smelled like lavender and old paper. She gestured to the table where she'd already spread out the map, weighting down the corners with smooth river stones. "I've been thinking about this since you left," she said. "The riddle, where the sun dies 3 times." She traced the 3 mountain peaks on the map. "These mountains," she said. "I know them. My father used to tell stories about them. The sun sets behind each peak in sequence as you watch from the valley below. First one, then the next, then the last. 3 deaths of the sun in a single evening." Tobias leaned over the map, close enough that he could smell the soap she used, something clean and simple. "So, the treasure is somewhere in that valley." She nodded. "But it's a 5-day ride from here through rough country. You'll need supplies, a better horse than that rental, and someone who knows the way." He looked at her. "You?" She met his eyes without flinching. "I know those mountains. My father prospected there before he died. And I can read the symbols on this map better than you can. You need me." He wanted to argue, to say he could handle it alone. But the truth was sitting right there between them. He couldn't, and she knew it. "What do you want in return?" he asked. "Half of whatever you find." He studied her face, looking for the trap, the angle, the lie. But all he saw was a woman tired of being alone in a town that had nothing left to offer her. A woman who saw a chance and was brave enough to take it. "Half," he agreed. They left 2 days later, early enough that the town was still sleeping. Faye had closed the store, telling her neighbor she was visiting a sick cousin to the east. No one questioned it. No one paid attention to the carpenter and the shopkeeper leaving in different directions and meeting up an hour outside of town. The country grew rougher as they traveled. Rolling hills gave way to steep climbs and narrow passes where the horses had to pick their way carefully over loose stone. At night, they made camp in whatever shelter they could find, burning small fires that gave more smoke than warmth. On the 3rd night, camped in a shallow cave, Faye cleaned a cut on Tobias's arm, where a branch had caught him during the day's ride. Her fingers were gentle but sure, and he found himself watching her face in the firelight. The way her brow furrowed when she concentrated, the way she bit her lower lip when she was thinking. "Why are you really doing this?" he asked quietly. She didn't look up from his arm. "Because I'm tired of watching you starve. Because I'm tired of being safe and small and invisible. Because when you walked into my store with that medallion, I saw a chance for something more than what I have." She finished wrapping the bandage and finally met his eyes. "And because I've been watching you for months, Tobias Marsh, watching you fight to stay alive, watching you refuse help because you're too proud to admit you need it. I'm doing this because maybe we both deserve something better than a slow death in a town that forgot we exist." Her hand was still resting on his arm. He became aware of how close she was, how the firelight turned her eyes into something warm and deep. He could lean forward, close the distance, see if what he felt was real or just loneliness talking. Instead, he pulled back. "We should get some sleep. Long day tomorrow." Something flickered across her face. Disappointment, maybe, or relief. She nodded and moved to her bedroll on the other side of the fire. He lay awake long after she'd fallen asleep, staring at the cave ceiling and trying to convince himself he'd made the right choice, trying not to think about the warmth of her hand on his arm, or the way she'd looked at him like he was worth something. In the darkness beyond their camp, two men sat on horseback and watched the small fire flicker in the cave mouth. They'd been following since the second day, staying far enough back to avoid detection. One of them turned his horse and rode back toward town. The other stayed and waited for dawn, patient as stone, ready to follow wherever Tobias and Faye led him next. They reached the valley on the fifth day, just as the sun began its slow descent toward the three peaks. Faye had been right. From where they stood, you could watch the sun die 3 times, disappearing behind each mountain in turn, the sky bleeding orange and red with each death before the final darkness came. The tomb entrance was hidden at the base of the center peak, concealed behind a rock slide that looked natural, but wasn't. Tobias could see it now that he knew what to look for, the way certain stones sat at angles that defied gravity, the gap behind them narrow but deliberate. They dismounted and approached on foot. The horses were nervous, stamping and pulling at their reins. Faye tied them to a twisted tree that somehow grew from the bare rock. Tobias squeezed through the gap first, lamp held high. The passage opened into a chamber so vast his lamplight couldn't reach the far walls. The air was cold and still, untouched by wind for what must have been decades, maybe longer. Faye came through behind him, her own lamp adding to the weak yellow glow. She gasped, and he understood why. The tomb was filled with treasure, not a chest, not a cache hidden in a corner. The entire chamber was a repository of wealth that made the first location look like pocket change. Gold bars were stacked in neat rows along one wall, each bar stamped with marks he didn't recognize. Jewels were scattered across stone shelves, rubies and emeralds and diamonds that caught the lamplight and threw it back in fractured colors. Elaborate crowns and ceremonial weapons, their hilts wrapped in gold wire, their blades etched with patterns that spoke of craftsmanship from another age. In the center of it all stood a stone sarcophagus, its surface carved with the same symbols that had been inside the medallion. It wasn't open, wasn't meant to be. This wasn't a grave robbed for its contents. This was a treasure vault, built to last forever, hidden in a place no one was supposed to find. Tobias set his lamp down with hands that shook. He walked to the nearest stack of gold bars and touched one just to make sure it was real. The metal was cold and solid under his fingers. He picked it up, heavy, unmistakably genuine. "This is impossible," he said. Faye moved through the chamber like she was in a dream, touching things gently, her face lit with wonder and disbelief. She picked up a crown encrusted with emeralds, turning it in her hands. "This is worth more than the entire town," she said quietly. "More than 10 towns. Tobias, do you understand what we found?" He understood. Understood that this much wealth changed everything, that they could take what they could carry and never worry about money again, that they could live anywhere, be anyone, start completely over. Understood that they'd never be allowed to keep it. Faye must have seen something in his expression, because she set the crown down and came to him. "We can do this," she said. "We can take enough to change our lives and hide the rest. Come back for it later when it's safe." He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe they could just walk out of here with bags full of gold and jewels and no one would stop them. But he'd seen the way Darius Gentry looked at those 2 coins, had seen the calculation in the man's eyes, and if Darius had figured out where those coins came from, he'd figure out where Tobias had gone. "We need to move fast," he said. "Take what we can carry and get out." They worked quickly, filling saddlebags with the smallest, most valuable pieces, gold bars, handfuls of loose gems, jewelry that would be easy to sell. Tobias estimated they were loading about $1 million worth of treasure, maybe more. A fraction of what filled the chamber, but more than enough. He was reaching for another gold bar when he heard it. Horses, multiple horses, approaching fast. Faye froze, a ruby necklace dangling from her hand. Her eyes found his across the chamber, wide with fear. Tobias moved to the entrance and looked out through the narrow gap. 6 riders coming down the valley slope, led by a man on a black horse. Even at this distance, even in the fading light. Tobias recognized him. Darius Gentry. And he was bringing company. Tobias turned back to Faye, his mind racing through options, through possibilities, through increasingly desperate plans. The entrance was the only way in or out. They were trapped, and Darius was minutes away from reaching them. "How much can you carry?" he asked. She stared at him. "What?" "How much can you carry and still run?" She looked at the saddlebags they'd been filling, then at the vast fortune still scattered around the chamber. Understanding dawned on her face, followed by something that looked like grief. "Not enough," she said. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off the valley walls. Tobias grabbed two of the smaller bags they'd filled, the ones with loose gems and gold coins, light enough to run with, valuable enough to matter. "Take these," he said, pressing one into her hands. "There's another way out. Has to be. These tombs always have a back entrance for the builders. We find it, we run, and we don't stop until we're so far away that Darius Gentry is just a bad memory." "And if there's no other way out?" she asked. "Then we fight," he said. Outside, Darius Gentry dismounted and walked toward the tomb entrance, his men fanning out behind him. He was smiling. He'd been patient. He'd tracked them carefully. And now, finally, the Cardoza treasure was his. All he had to do was take it. Darius Gentry squeezed through the tomb entrance with the confidence of a man who already owned what he'd come to claim. His men followed, lamps raised, guns drawn, the light multiplied, pushing back the shadows and revealing the full scope of the treasure scattered throughout the chamber. Darius stopped and stared, his breath catching audibly. Even for a man who'd spent years hunting this fortune, the reality exceeded imagination. He walked slowly to the nearest stack of gold bars, running his hand over them like he was touching something sacred. "Marsh," he called out, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "I know you're here. I know you found it first. And I'm willing to be reasonable about this." Tobias and Faye crouched behind the sarcophagus, their bags clutched tight. Tobias had his hand on the knife at his belt. Useless against 6 armed men, but better than nothing. Faye's breathing was quick and shallow beside him. "Come out," Darius continued. "We can negotiate. You found it. That's worth something. I'll give you 10%. That's more money than you'd see in 3 lifetimes. You walk away rich. Everyone's happy." Tobias didn't move, didn't believe a word of it. Men like Darius Gentry didn't negotiate. They took what they wanted and buried anyone who got in the way. One of Darius's men circled the chamber, lamp held high, checking corners. He was moving toward the sarcophagus. 30 seconds, maybe less, before he saw them. Tobias made his decision. He grabbed Faye's arm and pulled her toward the back wall, where he'd spotted a darker shadow among the stones. Up close, it resolved into a narrow passage, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The builder's exit, just like he'd hoped. "Now," he whispered. He pushed her toward the passage just as the man with the lamp rounded the sarcophagus and shouted, "There! Back wall! They're running!" Tobias threw his lamp at the man's face. It shattered against the stone beside him, oil spraying, fire catching. The man stumbled back, cursing. Tobias shoved Faye into the passage and followed, the bag of treasure clutched against his chest. The passage was tight and dark, the walls pressing close. Behind them, shouts echoed, boots scraped on stone. Darius was yelling orders, sending men after them, his voice sharp with rage. The passage angled up, steep enough that Tobias had to use his free hand to pull himself forward. Faye was ahead of him, moving fast despite the weight of her bag. Light appeared above. Not lamplight, but something cleaner. Daylight. They emerged on the mountainside, 50 yards above the main entrance, gasping and scraped raw from the tight passage. Their horses were too far away, still tied near the tomb entrance where Darius's men were. No way to reach them without being seen. "Run!" Tobias said. They ran down the slope, scrambling over loose rock, their bags slapping against their sides. Behind them, men poured from the builder's exit, shouting, pointing. A gunshot cracked the air. The bullet hit stone near Tobias's foot, sending chips flying. They reached a ravine and dropped into it, using the depression for cover. Tobias risked a look back. 4 men were coming down the slope. Fast. Too fast. Faye grabbed his arm. There! She pointed to a narrow cut in the ravine wall, a space where water runoff had carved a path deeper into the mountain, barely visible unless you were looking for it. They ran for it. The cut led into a maze of narrow canyons, each one branching into others. Tobias chose paths at random, focused only on distance and cover. Behind them, the shouts grew fainter. The men were spreading out, searching, but the canyons confused them. By the time the sun had fully died behind the 3 peaks, Tobias and Faye had put miles between themselves and the tomb. They moved in darkness now, careful and quiet, their bags lighter than they'd been in the chamber, but heavier than anything they'd carried before. They found shelter in an overhang just big enough for both of them. No fire, no light, just the 2 of them pressed together for warmth, listening to the night sounds, and wondering if every snap of a twig was Darius's men closing in. Faye spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. We left it all behind. The crown, the gold bars, everything. Tobias felt the weight of the bag he'd carried. Inside were loose gems, gold coins, a few pieces of jewelry. He'd grabbed what he could in the seconds before running. Maybe $1 million worth if he was lucky. Maybe less. A fraction of what they'd found. And Darius had the rest. 10 million, at least. Probably more. The man had won. But we're alive, Tobias said. Faye leaned against him, her shoulder pressing into his. Are we? Or are we just running until he catches us? He didn't have an answer for that. Didn't know if they'd ever be safe again. Darius Gentry didn't seem like the kind of man who let loose ends survive. We can't go back to town, Faye said. He'll have men watching, waiting. Tobias nodded in the darkness. We go south, cross into the next territory, find a place he doesn't own. And then what? Then we sell what we have and disappear. New names, new lives. He felt her shift beside him, felt her hand find his in the dark. Together, he added quietly. Her fingers tightened around his. You mean that? He thought about pulling away, about all the reasons this was a bad idea, about how he barely knew her, how she'd only helped him for the money, how trusting anyone was just asking to get hurt. But then he thought about how she'd stayed when she could have run, how she'd figured out the riddle and led him here, how she'd grabbed treasure and followed him into a dark passage without hesitation. Yeah, he said. I mean it. She kissed him then, quick and desperate and real. When she pulled back, he could feel her smiling in the darkness. Then we survive, she said. And we make it count. Somewhere in the valley behind them, Darius Gentry stood in the tomb chamber, surrounded by more wealth than he'd ever imagined. And all he could think about was the 2 people who'd slipped through his fingers, the carpenter and the shopkeeper who'd found it first. He'd let them go for now, let them think they'd escaped. But Darius Gentry was a patient man, and patient men always collected their debts. Eventually, they moved south for 3 days, avoiding roads and settlements, traveling only at dawn and dusk when the light made them harder to spot. Tobias's shoulder ached where a rock had caught him during the escape, a deep bruise that made lifting his arm painful. Faye had wrapped it as best she could with strips torn from her underskirt, but it needed proper care. On the 3rd night, they found a shallow cave carved into a hillside by wind and time. Faye insisted they stop. You're getting worse, she said. You need rest. He wanted to argue, to say they needed to keep moving, that Darius could still be tracking them, but his body betrayed him. When he sat down, he couldn't find the strength to stand back up. Faye made a small fire, keeping it low and smokeless. She heated water in the canteen and used it to clean his shoulder again. The bruise had darkened to deep purple, spreading across his skin like spilled ink. She touched it gently, checking for broken bones, and he hissed through his teeth at the pressure. "Nothing's broken," she said, "but you need to rest it. No more climbing or carrying heavy bags." He looked at the bag they'd brought, sitting near the cave entrance. Everything they'd risked their lives for, reduced to one canvas sack that weighed maybe 30 pounds. "We should count it," he said. "See what we actually got." She brought the bag over and opened it. Together they sorted through the contents. Loose gems, mostly rubies and emeralds, each one catching the firelight. Gold coins, 43 of them, matching the ones from the first cache. A necklace made of interlinking gold roses, 2 rings set with diamonds. A small golden statue of a bird, its wings spread like it was frozen mid-flight. Faye lined everything up carefully. She had a better eye for value than he did. "This is worth something," she said finally. "Maybe $1 million if we find the right buyers. Maybe more if we're patient." Tobias picked up the golden bird, turning it in his hands. $1 million split 2 ways. 500,000 each, enough to buy land, build a house, live comfortably for the rest of their lives. And all they had to do was survive long enough to spend it. "Why did you really come with me?" he asked. "Not the answer you gave before. The real reason." Faye was quiet for a long moment, staring at the sordid treasure between them. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I've been watching you for months, Tobias. Watching you come into my store, getting thinner, getting quieter, like you were disappearing a little more each day. And I wanted to do something about it. I wanted to help, but you wouldn't let anyone close." She looked up at him, and in the firelight, her eyes were wet. "When you bought that medallion, when I saw you looking at it like maybe it was something that could save you, I knew. I knew that if I didn't do something right then, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to try." Tobias set the bird down carefully. "You came for me, not the treasure." "I came because I love you," she said. The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating. "I've loved you for months, and I'm tired of pretending I don't. I'm tired of being careful and safe and alone. So yes, I came for you. The treasure was just an excuse to finally do what I should have done a long time ago." He stared at her, his mind struggling to process what she'd said. All this time, he'd thought she was just being kind, thought her offers of help were pity or business sense or anything but what they actually were. "Faye," he started, but she shook her head. "You don't have to say anything. I know you're not ready. I know you've got walls built up that I can't climb. But I needed you to know. Needed you to understand why I'm here and why I'm staying, no matter what happens next." He reached for her hand, his fingers rough and scarred against her palm. "I spent so long thinking I wasn't worth wanting," he said quietly. "That nobody would look at a broke carpenter and see anything but a burden. I pushed everyone away because it was easier than being disappointed." "And now?" she asked. "Now I'm sitting in a cave with a woman who followed me into danger and risked everything for me. And I'm realizing that maybe I was wrong." He pulled her closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "Maybe I'm worth something after all." She smiled, and it transformed her face. "You've always been worth something. You just needed someone to show you." He kissed her then, not quick or desperate like before, but slow and deliberate. A kiss that tasted like promises and new beginnings. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. "We're going to make it," she said. "We're going to get somewhere safe, sell what we have, and build something good, something that's ours." He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that they could outrun their past, and Darius Gentry and everything that had led them to this moment. But hope was a dangerous thing for people like them. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow we keep moving south. We don't stop until we're across the border, and then we figure out the rest." She nodded against his shoulder, her arms wrapped around him despite his injury. They sat like that as the fire burned down to embers, two people holding on to each other in the darkness, pretending they couldn't hear the sound of horses in the distance, getting closer with each passing hour. Because Darius Gentry hadn't given up. He'd taken the 10 million from the tomb, secured it, and sent his best men after the loose ends. The carpenter and the shopkeeper had embarrassed him, had found his treasure first, had escaped when they should have died. And Darius Gentry did not tolerate loose ends. His men were 3 hours behind and closing fast. By dawn, they'd have the cave surrounded, and then there would be nowhere left to run. Tobias woke to the sound of boots on stone. Dawnlight filtered through the cave entrance, weak and gray. Faye was already awake, her hand on his arm, her eyes wide with fear. She pointed toward the entrance without speaking. 3 men stood silhouetted against the morning sky. 2 more appeared on the ridge above the cave. They'd been surrounded while they slept. Tobias grabbed the bag with their treasure and pulled Faye to her feet. The back of the cave narrowed into darkness. Maybe another passage, maybe just solid rock, but it was the only option they had. They moved fast, stumbling over loose stones, the bag clutched between them. Behind them, boots scraped as the men entered the cave. A voice called out, "Darius wants you alive. Come out now and nobody gets hurt." Tobias didn't believe that for a second. The cave narrowed until they had to move sideways, pressed against cold stone. Then it opened again into a smaller chamber with light coming from above. A crack in the rock, barely wide enough to squeeze through. Tobias boosted Faye up first, then handed her the bag. She pulled herself through and reached back down for him. His injured shoulder screamed as he pulled himself up, but fear and desperation made him strong. He squeezed through the crack just as the first man reached the narrow passage below. The man tried to follow, got stuck halfway, cursed, and retreated. Tobias and Faye ran. They were on a ridge now, exposed with nowhere to hide. Below them, Darius's men were spreading out, cutting off escape routes. 2 of them had rifles. One was already raising his weapon, taking aim. Tobias saw a steep slope ahead, too steep to walk down, but maybe possible to slide. He grabbed Faye's hand and they jumped, hitting the loose scree and sliding in a controlled fall that sent rocks cascading down ahead of them. Bullets kicked up dirt near their heads. They kept sliding, faster now, out of control, until they hit the bottom in a tumbling heap. Tobias's shoulder felt like it was on fire. Faye's face was scraped and bleeding, but they were alive and still moving. They ran through a dried creek bed, using it for cover. The men were following, but slower now, more cautious after the slide. Tobias's mind raced. They couldn't outrun them forever. They had no horses, no weapons except his knife, and men with rifles on their trail. Then he heard it. Water. Not the trickle of a creek, but something bigger. Rushing water somewhere ahead. They burst from the creek bed and found themselves at the edge of a river, wide and fast, swollen from mountain runoff. On the other side, maybe 200 feet away, was different territory, a different jurisdiction, a place where Darius's men had no authority and no power. Faye looked at the water, then at Tobias. "We can't swim that. The current will kill us." He pulled her close, his lips near her ear. "Hold on to the bag. Hold on to me, and don't let go, no matter what." She nodded, understanding what he was asking, understanding that this was their last chance. They jumped together. The water hit like a physical blow, cold enough to steal breath. The current grabbed them immediately, pulling them under. Tobias kicked hard, fighting toward the surface, one hand locked on the bag, the other wrapped around Faye's wrist. They broke the surface, gasping, went under again, came up farther downstream. The current was impossibly strong, pushing them toward the far bank but also downstream, away from where Darius's men were gathering on the shore. One of them raised his rifle, but they were moving too fast, too erratic. The shot went wide. Tobias's boots hit bottom. He pulled Faye to her feet, and they staggered up the far bank, coughing and shaking. But alive. Behind them, across the water, Darius's men stood and watched. One of them started to enter the water, but another pulled him back. They'd lost. Their targets were across the border now, beyond reach. Tobias and Faye collapsed on the bank, too exhausted to move farther. The bag had stayed with them, waterlogged but intact. Everything inside was soaked, but gold and gems don't care about water. "We did it," Faye said between gasps. "We actually did it." Tobias looked back across the river at the men who'd been hunting them. They were already turning away, heading back to report their failure to Darius Gentry. The chase was over. They walked for 2 more days before they reached a settlement large enough to have a proper doctor and a merchant who asked no questions about where they'd gotten their goods. The doctor tended to Tobias's shoulder. The merchant bought 3 of their gems for enough cash to get them to Mexico. 3 months later, they stood in a small house on the outskirts of a coastal town, watching the sun set over water that stretched to infinity. They'd sold the rest of their treasure carefully to different buyers in different cities. The $1 million had become real money in banks under new names. They'd bought this house, this life, this future. Tobias pulled the medallion from his pocket. He'd kept it. The thing that had started everything. 25 cents and a piece of tarnished brass that had led them here. Faye came up beside him, her hand sliding into his. "You gonna keep that forever?" He smiled. "It reminds me that 25 cents and a little courage can change everything. And that some people are worth more than all the gold in the world." She kissed him as the sun touched the horizon. They'd survived. They'd escaped. And now they had the rest of their lives to figure out what came next, together. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything.